In the early years, steam engines were almost always painted black. Many were built by the Baldwin Locomotive Works in Philadelphia. Their bright red number badges stood out against the jet black boilers. At first, the early boilers were fired by wood. The Virginia and Truckee crossing the Truckee River on a bright, sunny morning. The V&T, as it was called for short, was known as the Golden Girl of the short line railroads. The entire roadbed was less than 50 miles long, but in that short distance, it carried millions of dollars in silver from the Comstock mines of Virginia City. Baldwin Locomotive Works of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, built a series of classic steam engines with large drive wheels that could negotiate the sharp turns to Virginia City. The rails were shipped all the way around the Horn from Sheffield, England, where they were originally forged. These old V&T engines are highly prized in collections all around the country. Many were sold off to movie companies, which most likely saved these grand old iron horses from being cut up for scrap metal during the Second World War. Today, perhaps the best collection of V&T engines can be viewed in Carson City, Nevada, at the Permanent Rail Museum south of town. This is one of the early V&T engines called the Inyo. Like all the other engines at this museum, it's been meticulously restored to its original gleaming perfection. The boiler is wood-fired, and the brass is usually all shined up like Sunday. On select weekends, they open the doors, fire up the boilers, and roll out the engines. Now, occasionally, the engines pull onto this device that looks like a bridge. Actually, it's a large hand-operated turnstile, sort of like an overgrown merry-go-round for trains. They use it to rotate the engines off of one track and onto a new track in a short distance, so the train can move in a new direction. They blow the whistles, clang the bells, and you can take rides on these wonderful old trains in Carson City. The Virginia and Truckee Railroad, which was called the V&T for short, was known as the Golden Girl of the short line railroads. The V&T had almost 30 steam locomotives working on less than 100 miles of track. The 56-pound rails were shipped around the Horn of South America from Sheffield, England. History records that one of the first engines was hauled up this steep grade by a 40-hitch team of oxen. Unfortunately, the locomotive got mired down in the mud on this turn.
The story goes that after several days, they couldn't get the locomotive unstuck, and so they left it abandoned right here on this grade until the spring thaw. Such was the way of life in the early West.
The miners, well, they blasted several tunnels into the rock so the V&T could climb the steep grades from Carson City all the way up to Virginia City. The grade was so steep and the turns so sharp, they fitted 72 high-inch drive wheels onto the engines so they could negotiate the sharp turns. These high, classic-looking drive wheels were what undoubtedly saved so many V&T engines from the scrapper's cutting torch. When the rail line closed in 1953, Hollywood studios bought up many of the old engines. They played a starring role in numerous old Western movies.
Back in 1862, they didn't have concrete, so they cut these rocks out of quarries and stacked them. They did a darn good job, because here it is 130 years later, and they're still here. You can walk along these old right-of-ways out here in the West and relive that glorious era that was once steam.
In select places like this, you can still see the remains of the old V&T trestles down in the canyons. Look at these 12 by 12 beams, soaked in creosote oil for protection from the insects and rotting. They're just as stout now as the day they were lifted into place. Remarkably, these handcrafted trestles still survive from the late 1870s. And though it's almost 125 years old, the same foundation rocks that were laid by hand are just as neatly packed as if the job were done yesterday, thank you. Back then, it was believed that things worth doing were worth doing well. And they did.
It doesn't take a lot of effort to find old buried railroad spikes like this along the right-of-way. You can tell the really old spikes by how thin and slender they are. For some, these spikes have a story all their own. Who knows but what some Gandy dancer chucked this very spike right over his shoulder 130 years ago as they set a new section of track right here in this cut.
Now down in Carson City, they've restored a great deal of the old V&T engines and placed them in a handsome museum for all to see. This old wood burner is called the Inyo. Her brass is spotless to perfection, one of the oldest surviving locomotives. On holiday weekends, they pull the engines out of the roundhouse and run them about on an oval track. Why, they even have an old turntable, once used to turn the engine and tender after it came out of the roundhouse. This old water tower came from one of the service stops in Washoe Valley. There's not too much film that survives from the original V&T, but here we see it as the engineer and fireman turn the engine across the river in Reno. Today, the old turntable's gone. In its place, a lot full of weeds, surrounded by high-rise casinos. And this is the way number 27 looked when it left Reno and crossed the Truckee River. Today, these old concrete piers are all that remain of the old bridge that crossed the river. The motel sits where the tracks used to run. This is the way the roundhouse looked in Carson City before they tore it down. Grover Russell? Now he was the last engineer to pull the final train over the V&T track. And here a lady waved to the train as it crossed the highway at New Washoe City. Today, tourists ride over the V&T right-of-way aboard this short line railroad in historic Virginia City. Many of the old V&T structures, like the Gold Hill Station, have been preserved. Now, this grand structure is St. Mary's of the Mountains, a Catholic church still used today by Virginia City residents. The walls were specially built to withstand vibration. You see, back in the 1870s, they ran the railroad tracks right under the church. The train, well, it passes through this original tunnel that was blasted open by Virginia City miners. Plans are in the works to extend the ride from Virginia City all the way down to Carson City and back.